Ponytales. Read by Scribbler. Falter by ZaleAcon. The quiet drops of black rain pattered against the broken windowsill. Water leaked into the emergency room, running in slow, careful streams across the cracked stone of the floor. The doctor placed his talons on the edge of the bed, glancing across the flickering yet functioning screen with quiet nervousness on his face. He was a small, middle-aged griffin, no larger than a fully grown mare, and his feathers were marred with dirt, grime, and were wet from the rain that leaked from the ceiling. His patient, if she could be called that, lay in the middle of an old operating table. She was also a griffin, albeit a much younger one, and with far more pristine plumage that was matted with blood. She was completely unconscious, her slow breathing the only sign that she still lived, despite the massive pipe protruding from her side. The doctor clutched the scalpel harshly. Did he cut or not? Was it worth the risk? His talons trembled at the thought. He breathed in just once and stilled his shaking claws. He knew there was no point in leaving it in. Such a thing as that would kill her if it were in any longer. Even without a way to dull the pain, he could not risk it. His talons shook slightly. The white, sterile hospital gleamed in the morning sun. Its halls reflected the light that came through the massive windows as though no creature had walked through them in decades. Dr. Richard Crow, a young griffin wearing a lab coat, glanced over the edge of his clipboard as a nurse approached him.
"May I help you, miss?"
he asked dismissively.
"Yes, doctor."
She was a young earth pony and kept her red mane tied up so that it could barely be seen under her hat.
Dr. Springs wants you to help him in the operating room.
Crow raised an eyebrow.
"Is it serious?"
Yes, doctor. He wanted me to find you as soon as I could.
Right.
Crow placed the clipboard down on a nearby table.
I'll go down immediately then. Thank you, nurse.
Chime, doctor. Nurse Chime.
Ah, thank you.
Crow glanced off toward the operating room.
Then I shall be off.
The doctor could hear the rain tapping against the broken glass outside the dilapidated hospital. Water gathered around his pores, merging with the blood of his patient. The scalpel shook, even as he tried to calm his frightened nerves. Why was he so terrified? It would be a simple matter to him. He had to remain calm, cool, and collected. It would hardly do for a doctor to become so nervous in front of a patient. He gripped the scalpel tighter and breathed in deeply. He could smell the patient's blood and the rotting leaves blowing in the wind. The doctor breathed out, trying desperately to cleanse his body of anything that could possibly set him on edge again. Crow placed his talons on the wall.
I've never seen a case like this.
He looked over at Springs.
Did you say that her whole family?
Dr. Emerald Springs nodded.
Yes, from what the report says, she and her family were traveling by chariot when the two creatures pulling them vanished.
He paused and placed a blue-green hoof to his forehead.
She was the only one who survived.
Crow grit his teeth.
Those disappearances, they've been increasing lately, if what I've heard is correct.
Yes, and it looks as though it's not just those who are taken who are the victims.
Springs shook his head sadly and looked at the bloody, unconscious unicorn. Crow nodded.
Yes, I agree.
He picked up a scalpel and stepped over to the patient.
Come on. This is going to be a delicate process. and we need to start now.
The doctor placed the scalpel on the bed next to his patient and breathed deep. Why was this so hard for him? He just needed to relax. He had done this many times before, so why was this one so difficult? His patient was unconscious. Pain was not an issue. Even though she continued to mutter that weird name in her sleep, something dash? She was clearly not lucid by any definition of the word. Pain did not matter to those who could not feel it, so that was definitely not the issue. Then why was he so worried? He shouldn't have been. The doctor breathed in deep once more and picked up the scalpel. Time was running low, and the heart monitor was starting to slow down. There was no time for feeling worried about failure.
No, damn it, no!
Crow pressed his weight to the gaping wound, attempting to hold the blood in the patient's body.
Damn it!
Springs grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled Crow away. His feathers had turned bright red.
Dr. Crow!
Yet Springs' words made little impact on Crow in his state of mindless terror.
Please, do not waste your energy.
Shut up!
Crow pushed his way back to the patient.
I won't. I can't just...
The sound of hoof meeting face echoed throughout the room. Crow pressed his talons to the bruise, which had already started to turn red. Even the unflappable Springs looked shaken by what he had just done.
She's dying, Doctor. There is no point in wasting your time and energy on a creature with no chance of survival.
He glanced to the doors.
We must instead assist those who we can. But now, all we can do is ease her passing.
Springs pulled a small syringe from his bag. It was filled with a greenish substance, almost matching his coat. Although his hooves trembled, he placed the syringe into the patient's side. Within mere minutes, she stopped convulsing completely.
You...
Crow whispered, and stepped over to the patient's corpse. Blood continued to run from the large wound, but it seemed as though she had stopped feeling it.
I know, Dr. Crow. Believe me.
Springs shook his head and replaced the needle in his bag.
Death is never something simple to look at. I've seen more than my fair share of it.
He grimaced.
It's all part of being a surgeon. Sometimes you can save your patient, but...
This never should have happened.
Crow groaned.
These disappearances, she never should have.
I know, Doctor, but these things happen.
Springs paused, as if thinking.
You have been doing these surgeries with us for years. Have you ever seen death?
Crow shook his head.
I have. But I've never caused it.
The doctor's throat became tight. He could smell the blood running under his pores again, even as he tried to focus on the patient. His eyesight was blurring, his throat ached, and he could feel his eyes become moist. The scalpel shook worse than ever, and his senses flared into overdrive. His patient continued her quiet mantra, but the doctor was not paying attention to it anymore. He was too busy trying to stay focused on keeping his talons still to notice much else. But the stench of mud, rotting leaves, and blood did nothing to help him do so. The doctor screwed his eyes shut and breathed in deep again. He ignored the disgusting odours and focused on his patient once more. His talons still shook, but he had to work past that. He wouldn't make the same mistakes again. But just as he raised the scalpel to begin the surgery, the sound of a low, quiet beeping noise echoed off the wall. The doctor's eyes widened in horror, and he turned to look at the flickering monitor. Flatline. The scalpel slipped from his talons and hit the ground with a dull clank. The water and blood ran under it, as if mocking what had once been sterile. The doctor stumbled back from the patient, her body still, her mouth unmoving.
No.
He whimpered, pressing his back to the wall.
No!
He slid down the wall slowly, his eyes glazing over as the world became a blur of sights and smells. He let out a low, quiet moan.
No.
And then the doctor placed his talons over his face and wept. That was Falter. It was written by ZaleAcon and read by Scribbler, with special guest voice actors FinishLine as the voice of Dr. Crow, CassyPony as the voice of Nurse Chime, and VisualPony as the voice of Dr. Emerald Springs. Okay, thank you very much for listening. This is the next part in this very loose trilogy by ZaleAcon called the Fading Trilogy. And it is a sort of sequel to follow-up to last week's End. And you may have noticed it didn't feature Twilight Sparkle, and that is because, yes, at the end of last week's reading, she did vanish. And she can't be in it anymore because she's gone. And this is one of the things I find that puts this series into the grimdark category, is that it's irreversible what happens to the characters. There is no fix-it button. There is no coming back. There is the end of the world, slowly and inevitably and inexplicably. And in a world of magic, that could happen. And to me, the grimdark element of it is the fact that nothing will go right. Everything is wrong. Everything is going wrong for these characters, and despite the fact they're trying to find some sense among the chaos, like Dr. Crow did here when he was trying to fix up Gilda, you can't in a situation like this. And that's a very hard concept for a human brain to wrap around. This idea that you can't fight something, you can't stop it, you can't resist it, you can't rail against it in anything other than the way you feel and what you say. There is nothing you can do to stop this bad thing from happening to you, and you won't even understand it while it's going on. And to me, that puts this trilogy in the grimdark category for me, even though, as some people have pointed out, I got told last week that this shouldn't be categorised as grimdark because it's not gory. And grimdark doesn't have to be gory. There is an entire podcast that the Lost Narrator and I did about this, about the nature of grimdark, which is on her channel, The Lost Extras, which I will link below. And the fact that there is very, very little blood or violence in these stories doesn't reduce their impact for me. And I think that the concepts and the themes carry it over into grimdark. And helped immensely in this case by the performances. I mean, FinishLine, CassyPony and VisualPony deserve a lot of kudos for this. FinishLine is absolutely stellar performance that when we record things for each other, we always provide more than one take of each line. And there were so many good takes that he gave me that I genuinely had trouble picking between them. And VisualPony, he stepped in at the last minute to help me because my dumbass had not realised that the character of Dr. Emerald Springs and Nurse Chime were actually separate characters. I thought it was Nurse Springs. So he really saved my bacon on that and gave a really sterling performance, considering that he literally did it at the last minute for me. And yet he pulled that out? It's brilliant. And poor CassyPony, she recorded this in the midst of having an absolutely heinous cold. So pat on the back to her, lots of blemsip, and just, pay them all the compliments in the world, because they really did a lot with this story, and I can't thank them enough. And with that, I shall have to love you and leave you. Next week it will be the final part of this, like I said, very loose trilogy. It is more conceptually and thematically linked as opposed to narratively linked. But next week I have a voice actress whom I've worked with before, who genuinely, I think this is the best performance I've ever been given by a collaborator. And I'm not just saying that for the sake of hyperbole. I'm not just saying that to compliment her. Genuinely, this is one of the best performances from a guest voice actor that I've ever been able to put on my channel. And considering the standard of performances today, that's saying a lot. So, tune in next week for that one. And with that, be lovely to each other, and good night, everybody.